Arnhem, September 1944. The city was a map of ruins, walls ripped open like torn paper, tram lines twisted into claws, the air thick with the metallic scent of fire and grief. Somewhere beneath the shattered stones of a half-collapsed cellar, a Dutch man named Adrian van Leeuwen, age 32, searched for anything still sealed, still whole. His fingers, cracked and blackened, brushed against a round metal tin wedged between bricks. The label was faded but legible. U.S. Army Field Ration Type C, coffee instant. He turned it in his trembling hands, whispering as though it might be alive. For weeks, Adrian had eaten only boiled tulip bulbs. When the tin finally clicked open, a hiss escaped, like a sigh. Powder spilled into the air. Then came the smell. It was impossible to describe. Bitter yet warm, foreign yet familiar. A smell that seemed to rewind time. He closed his eyes. For 5 seconds, war ceased to exist. Later, when others asked him why he had cried, he said simply, "For 5 seconds, the war stopped inside my head." The sound of shells returned soon enough, but those 5 seconds changed everything. In the dim cellar light, Adrian shared the coffee dust with 3 others hiding below. His sister Marijke, an elderly teacher named Van Dalen, and a boy barely 15. They mixed the powder with rainwater heated by a candle stub. The taste was thin, metallic, yet when the first sip touched their tongues, they laughed, softly, uncontrollably. The boy asked, "Is this what peace tastes like?" Marijke replied, "No, this is what it used to taste like." Outside, the British 1st Airborne Division was fighting to hold the bridge. Inside, 4 civilians shared the first American coffee they had ever seen. It was 14 September, the 5th day of Operation Market Garden. Arnhem was supposed to be liberated within hours, but instead it became a trap. Thousands would die, thousands more would flee. And yet, within that chaos, a tin of coffee had survived the bombing that flattened a city. A few streets away, a German corporal named Hans Richter, assigned to guard prisoners, also smelled the aroma drifting through cracked windows. He couldn't believe it. For years, his unit in the Wehrmacht had drunk ersatz coffee, burnt acorns, chicory, and barley husks pretending to be coffee. He muttered to his comrade, "The Dutch are drinking better than we are." His comrade spat. "Let them. It won't save them." But it did, in a way. Later that night, Richter wrote in his confiscated notebook, "They laugh under rubble. I envy them. Our empire commands the world, but I have forgotten the smell of mornings." Across the Atlantic, at the same hour, factory lights still burned in Newark, New Jersey, where women in overalls filled tin after tin of coffee powder, 6,000 per shift. The war machine never slept. Every can sealed was a fragment of morale, a small proof that comfort could be manufactured like ammunition. Adrian's tin was one of 1.2 million shipped through British ports to feed Allied troops and occupied civilians. It had crossed oceans, outlived ships sunk by U-boats, and somehow ended up in a ruined Dutch cellar. No speech, no sermon could have moved those hiding civilians as deeply as that scent of roasted beans. The scent of a world that still believed in breakfast. The cellar stayed quiet for a long time. Only the faint tapping of falling plaster echoed above. Marijke whispered, "Keep the tin." Adrian nodded, wiping soot from the label. He did not know that 3 months later, during the winter famine, that empty tin would serve as their only cup. When historians later asked survivors of Arnhem what memory haunted them most, they did not name the screams or explosions. They said it was the moment the coffee smell rose through the rubble, when the scent of life dared to compete with the smell of death. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? They called it Orlog's coffee, war coffee. For 5 long years under Nazi occupation, that was all the Dutch had known. Roasted acorns, burned chicory, or ground-up beets boiled in thin water until it turned the color of rust. To many, the word coffee no longer meant a drink. It meant memory. It meant the sound of morning cups clinking before the invasion, when the smell of roast drifted from every kitchen window along the canals of Utrecht, Amsterdam, and The Hague. That world was gone. By 1944, real coffee was a myth. People joked that their substitutes were good for cleaning boots, not soles. But when a small group of refugees from Arnhem found an intact tin of American instant coffee left behind by Allied medics, the myth suddenly returned as reality. They gathered around it like pilgrims around a relic. The powder hissed when it met the boiling water, and a faint steam rose, smelling of something so familiar it hurt. One woman, Lena de Groot, widow of a bookseller, lifted her cup with trembling hands. She didn't say, "It's delicious." Instead, she whispered, "This tastes like a morning that wasn't bombed." Around her, silence deepened. Even the children understood the difference. They had never lived a morning without fear, without ration bells, without German boots on cobblestones. This taste was not about flavor. It was about the life they had lost. During those years, the Netherlands had been drained of its warmth. Coffee was rationed to nothing. Restaurants brewed substitutes from rye and carrot peelings. Families saved tiny dandelion roots, roasting them secretly over candles. Every black cup was an act of defiance. A diary found after the war from a Rotterdam nurse recorded, "We still pour it into porcelain cups, though we know it's not real. Pretending we are still civilized is our only protest." When the first American rations reached Dutch soil in early 1944, tins of genuine coffee, sugar, chocolate, and powdered milk, they carried more than calories. They carried a philosophy: life must go on. And the Dutch, exhausted and starved, understood that better than anyone. One historian later wrote that among all relief foods, coffee had the highest emotional impact. Not bread, not meat, but coffee, because it symbolized the return of routine. To wake up, to boil water, to breathe steam, to begin another day. In a world turned upside down, that small ritual meant civilization had survived. As Lena sipped, she closed her eyes and saw her husband again, reading the morning paper, sunlight on his face, before the Gestapo took him for hiding a Jewish family. For 5 years, she had refused to cry. But now, with one mouthful of bitter American coffee, the tears finally came. Her neighbor whispered, "Are you all right?" She smiled weakly. "Yes, it tastes like before." The paradox of that moment, drinking the taste of peace while bombs still fell, would stay with them for decades. Survivors later told interviewers that they did not remember the first Allied tank they saw or the first flag raised, but they remembered the first smell of coffee. One woman said, "It was the scent that told us we were human again." Outside, the war ground on. Bridges exploded, markets burned, yet inside those basements and barns, a simple tin reshaped what survival meant. It wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying awake to the idea of life after the noise stopped. Historians estimate that between 1940 and 1945, the Netherlands lost nearly 2.5 billion guilders worth of food supplies to occupation demands, and over 20,000 civilians died from starvation during the hunger winter. But the small tins of imported coffee that slipped through via Red Cross parcels became symbols of dignity. Some Dutch refugees said that drinking it was like tasting freedom before it arrived. Others said it was too painful, like being reminded of a world too far away. But none forgot that first real sip. If the war was a night that refused to end, then that coffee, dark, bitter, real, was the first faint dawn in their mouths. In February 1944, as Europe froze under its fourth wartime winter, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps in Philadelphia ran an experiment that few remembered, but many later owed their morale to. Inside a warehouse on Delaware Avenue, engineers tested metal tins under fireproof torches, explosion simulators, and water pressure machines. Their goal wasn't armor or ammunition, it was coffee. Coffee that could survive war. The lead designer, Captain Walter Briggs, a logistics engineer who had once worked at the Maxwell House plant in Chicago, told a reporter, "Every can we ship must endure a soldier's march, a submarine's depth, and a bomb's heat. If it bursts, morale bursts with it." He wasn't exaggerating. In 1944 alone, the U.S. Army issued over 12 million tins of instant coffee across Europe. The quartermaster called it the most essential stimulant in the field after ammunition. Soldiers nicknamed it the brown bullet. And Briggs's favorite phrase spread among the ranks, "Each can is a bullet of morale." The Dutch, when they first learned this through Allied leaflets and gossip among refugees, found it absurd until they saw it. The tins really did survive explosions. In a wrecked Jeep outside Nijmegen, a farmer pulled 3 intact cans from the rubble. He couldn't believe that a factory across the ocean had thought about keeping coffee alive while entire cities burned. He said to his neighbor, "They don't send us wishes, they send us persistence, vacuum sealed." The humor of that remark carried through the Dutch underground. Resistance couriers joked that America had industrialized optimism. They traded tins of coffee for safe passage, medicine, even guns. Somewhere between the black market and the blackouts, a quiet realization emerged. Morale, too, could be mass-produced. Captain Briggs never set foot in Europe. He spent the war behind assembly lines, timing machines that sealed 30 tins a minute. He wrote to his wife in May 1944, "I sometimes wonder if these cans matter. Then I read the field reports, men trading cigarettes for a spoonful of coffee before a raid, and I think maybe this is our front line." That letter was later found in a Red Cross archive smudged by oil and coffee stains. Meanwhile, in occupied Holland, the same product became a mirror of contrasts. To the Germans, it represented enemy comfort. To the Dutch, it was invisible hope. A few captured soldiers spoke with disbelief when they saw civilians drink it. One Wehrmacht officer told his interpreter, "You don't understand. They're winning because they drink like it's peacetime." He wasn't entirely wrong. The United States had made morale a system. The victory blend, as some factories called it, was formulated not just for taste, but endurance. Stable, heat-resistant, mixable in any water. To Dutch eyes, this was more than coffee. It was proof that technology could care. By the spring of 1944, Red Cross shipments began distributing American rations to civilian hospitals across the Netherlands. Nurses used leftover tins to store gauze and medicine. Children used the lids as makeshift mirrors. When one hospital in Eindhoven received 20 boxes, the staff held what they called the first real break of the war. 10 minutes of silence, each person with a steaming cup, surrounded by ruins. A doctor later recalled, "For the first time, the smoke we saw wasn't from bombs." The irony of it all struck every survivor. That coffee had crossed the Atlantic under escort by destroyers, dodging torpedoes, passing bodies frozen in the sea. Each can arrive dented, scarred, yet intact. The Dutch began to see it as something larger than a beverage. It was defiance that could be brewed. Some said later that America's true secret weapon wasn't its tanks or planes, but its belief that even comfort could be engineered. And in that belief lay an invisible victory, the ability to make something warm survive something cold. In the end, Briggs's design became the quiet emblem of endurance. It didn't win battles on maps, but it won moments. Moments where humanity refused to dissolve. The Dutch who tasted it understood. Morale didn't fall from the sky with bombs. It arrived in tins, built by hands that believed warmth could outlast war. They brewed in silence, not to hide from soldiers, but to preserve a ritual too fragile for noise. By 1944, Arnhem's women had become masters of secrecy. Their husbands were gone, some conscripted, others shot or missing. The occupation had turned them into scavengers, midwives, mechanics, and now, unlikely baristas of courage. Every few nights, when the shelling quieted, they gathered in the basement of a ruined church on Eusebiusplein, the roof half collapsed, the stained glass saints shattered. There, beneath the gaze of broken angels, they heated water over a kerosene lamp and brewed American coffee, smuggled through Allied drops, hidden in wicker baskets, traded for eggs or candles. Anna Vermeer, a schoolteacher of 45, was their leader. Her hands were always shaking, but never when she poured. "We have no guns," she told the others, "but we have boiling water." Each time the tin hissed open, she crossed herself, not out of fear, but reverence. The smell filled the crypt-like room, masking the odor of dust and sweat. They called their secret circle De Warmte, the warmth. Their rules were simple. Anyone could join, but no one could cry. The coffee was to be drunk as if peace were already here. Among them was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, an American paratrooper from the 101st Airborne, wounded during Operation Market Garden. The women found him hiding in a barn, his leg torn by shrapnel, and carried him through alleyways into their cellar. They fed him broth, then coffee. Hayes would later write in a letter home, "It was the only time during the war I forgot which side I was on. The coffee tasted like home. Not mine, theirs." The women didn't understand his English, but they understood the look in his eyes. When he smiled after that first sip, it felt as if their city, for one breath, was liberated. Every act of brewing was an act of defiance. Coffee beans were contraband, arrest could mean death. Yet they brewed anyway, for neighbors, for the wounded, for themselves. Some ground barley to stretch the ration. Some boiled cloth filters clean, but no one diluted the ritual. To them, coffee was no longer a drink. It was a declaration that the Dutch spirit could not be rationed. One evening, as snow began to fall through the gaping roof, Anna poured the last of their powder into a dented kettle. A German patrol passed outside. They froze, listening. The boots stopped at the church door, lingered, then moved on. The women exhaled in unison. Someone whispered, "Even God holds his breath when we brew." That night, Hayes told Anna how American factories back home had women like her working night shifts, rolling tin lids, sealing coffee by the millions. He said each can carry a code number and a date. She turned the tin in her hands and read it. New York, July 17th, 1943. A moment of stillness followed. She whispered, "So this was made the summer before my husband died." Neither spoke again for a long time. When dawn came, the women opened the church doors. Snow had covered the ruins, softening their sharp edges. The air smelled faintly of roasted beans and candle wax. Anna looked over the silent square and said, "We'll brew again when the snow melts." After the war, Hayes kept that tin. He sent it to Anna with a note that read, "You showed me that warmth can survive under ruins." Decades later, the descendants of de Warmth would build a small memorial beside that same church, not of soldiers or generals, but of women pouring coffee beside a broken kettle. Because courage, they said, did not always fire bullets. Sometimes it just boiled water. Night fell early that winter, thick and soundless. The blackout curtains were gone, replaced by boarded windows and fear. In the village of Oosterbeek, only a handful of radios remained, smuggled, hidden under floorboards, wrapped in rags to muffle sound. The BBC signal came faint and trembling across the North Sea, its words like lanterns flickering in fog. That night, a broadcast broke through. "Liberation is near, Allied forces advancing north of the Rhine." The voice was distant, the static heavy, but the message was unmistakable. Liberation. Inside a cramped basement, 5 neighbors sat around a single candle. In the center stood a small tin kettle, steaming faintly. The old woman who owned the house, Mina Voss, poured the coffee slowly into chipped porcelain cups, one for each. No one spoke. The war had taught them silence. Joy was dangerous. Yet, as the radio whispered through the crackling air, Mina raised her cup and said softly, "Listen, it's the sound of morning." They drank, not to taste, but to believe. For years, they had replaced coffee with anything that could be roasted: acorns, rye, even carrot peelings, each bitter mouthful reminding them what was gone. But now, they were tasting something almost impossible. A future. It wasn't just caffeine that woke them, it was faith. In her diary, Mina later wrote, "The coffee trembled in the cup, as if it too was listening for freedom." Outside, artillery thundered from the distant front near Nijmegen. Every blast shook the walls, scattering dust into the cups. Yet none of them stopped drinking. The warmth in their throats was a rebellion all its own. Moments like this were repeated across the country, in attics, barns, and basements, wherever people could scrape together a few spoonfuls of American coffee from black market tins or Red Cross parcels. In every sip, they found something stronger than hope: continuity. The same smell their parents once knew, the same gesture of pouring, the same clinking of cups. Ordinary acts turned into defiance. Sociologists later called this phenomenon the culture of small survivals. Amid shortages, rituals replaced possessions. A tin cup could mean family, a smell could mean freedom. And in the Netherlands, coffee became the center of that quiet culture, the bridge between war and memory. As the broadcast ended, Mina refilled each cup with what little remained. dividing it carefully so no one would go without. The room glowed faintly in the candlelight. The radio crackled again. "This is London. Good night and good luck." They finished their coffee in silence. Then the young man sitting near the window whispered, "Do you think we'll really be free by spring?" Mina looked at the last drop in her cup. "I think," she said, "we already are, for as long as it's warm." That line would later appear in a post-war interview cited by a historian from Utrecht who documented 600 civilian diaries. He noted how often coffee appeared as the metaphor of resistance, not speeches, not flags, just warmth shared under siege. To the audience watching now, pause for a second. Imagine hearing that BBC voice through static, holding a chipped cup between bomb blasts. What would you have held on to if you had nothing left but a smell, a sound, and a sip of hope? Would you have risked arrest just to feel human again? That night, as the radio went silent, Mina collected the empty cups and rinsed them with melted snow. She saved the grounds to brew again the next day. "Waste nothing," she always said, not because it was habit, but because each spoonful of coffee had become sacred. When she died decades later, her children found the old kettle, still dented, still wrapped in the same rag that once muffled the radio's sound. On its lid was scratched a single word, "Louister, listen." And that, perhaps, was the true meaning of the cup. Not to drink, but to remind. Not to wake, but to keep listening. The war was ending, but no one dared to believe it yet. April 1945. The month when rumors of liberation hung heavier than the smoke from the bombed refineries. The river still carried the bodies of winter famine victims, and yet, somewhere beyond the North Sea, ships were already loading boxes stamped Netherlands Relief. Inside, milk powder, canned meat, cocoa, and 500,000 tins of coffee. Real American coffee, roasted in New York and Chicago, sealed by factory women whose hands would never see the places their warmth would save. When the ships docked in Rotterdam, the harbor was unrecognizable. Skeleton cranes jutted from the water, ships lay capsized in silt, and warehouses stood gutted. Yet, amid the ruins, longshoremen, Dutchmen in tattered coats, began unloading crates with trembling reverence. Each one bore the same symbol, a blue circle enclosing an eagle and a windmill. The Netherlands Relief Commission, a partnership of Americans and Dutch exiles, had finally arrived. They unloaded 500,000 tins of coffee in the first wave, enough to give one cup to nearly every surviving adult in the Western provinces. One newspaper later wrote, "It was not food that returned first, it was faith." Distribution was chaos and miracle in equal measure. From Rotterdam to Leiden, volunteers on bicycles carried tins and sacks marked American Relief. Some were intercepted by starving villagers who fell to their knees begging for one can. Others were escorted by Allied soldiers through ruins still mined with explosives. One British sergeant remembered an old Dutch woman pressing a tin to her chest and saying, "This smells like the end of the war." In a letter preserved in the National Archives, a refugee named Carol Brower wrote to the commission, "When we poured the first coffee, my wife fainted. Not from hunger, from memory. The smell was the smell of weddings, of Sundays, of laughter. It brought everything back." Even hardened soldiers paused to watch civilians cry over cups of steaming brown liquid. A medic from the 1st Canadian Army noted, "They held their mugs like relics. I saw more tears in that warehouse than I did in hospitals." But the relief workers knew coffee was more than charity. It was a bridge between conqueror and liberated, between soldier and survivor. Sharing it meant acknowledging that comfort had power equal to conquest. Meanwhile, in New York, newspapers printed photographs of Dutch families holding American tins beside their bicycles. The captions read, "The first warmth returns." Sales of Maxwell House and Nescafé surged overnight, their ads quoting letters from Holland as proof that a cup can rebuild a world. To the Dutch, the meaning ran deeper. They called it de belofte in een beker, the promise in a cup. It wasn't about flavor or luxury. It was about trust. For years, they had been told the Allies would come, that faith alone could sustain them. But faith, without something to taste, had begun to fade. Then came the coffee, real, tangible, fragrant. And suddenly, belief became physical again. By late April, the cans reached even the northernmost provinces. Children lined up outside town halls with tin cups, waiting for a ladle of dark liquid. One journalist wrote that the smell filled the air like a hymn. Another called it the scent of the free world. Pause here, audience. If you were among those survivors, weak, cold, clutching a chipped cup after years of hunger, what would that first sip mean to you? Would you call it relief or resurrection? When the first Dutch radio broadcast returned to national airwaves on May 7th, the announcer ended with a single line that captured what words could not. Tonight, Holland sleeps in warmth again. And somewhere in Rotterdam, Mina Vos, the same woman who once brewed in the dark, lifted a cup from her ration pack and whispered, "It's hotter than victory." Then she laughed, the first true laugh in 5 years. May 1945. The air itself seemed to exhale. The thunder of artillery faded into an unfamiliar silence that felt heavier than sound. Across the Netherlands, people woke to the same question: what now? After 5 years of occupation, hunger, and despair, liberation did not come with fanfare. It came with exhaustion. Streets were littered with broken furniture, hollowed churches, and faces too thin to smile. Yet on that morning, in a half-ruined town near Utrecht, a woman named Lena de Groot lit a small stove and reached for a tin she had saved through the entire war. The label was nearly gone, scraped and faded, but she could still read one word: coffee. Her hands trembled as she pried it open. There was just enough left for 2 cups. Outside, the rumble of engines grew louder, Allied jeeps, olive green and dust-covered, rolling through the main square. Children ran behind them waving tulips and pieces of fabric painted like flags. Soldiers tossed chocolate bars into the crowd. A band tried to play a half-remembered march. And through it all, the smell of Lena's coffee drifted from her doorway, winding upward into the morning air. Her neighbor, Marieke van Leeuwen, joined her. Neither spoke. They had survived the winter famine together, buried friends together, dreamed of this day through static-filled radio whispers. Now that it had arrived, they didn't cheer, they brewed. Steam rose from the kettle, curling into the sunlight breaking through shattered windows. The 2 women sat on the doorstep, mugs in hand, watching liberation unfold. In that moment, there were no speeches, no vengeance, no songs. Only the steady sound of coffee boiling and a slow realization that they were free. A Canadian lieutenant passing by caught the scent, stopped and smiled. He saluted them and said, "That smells like victory." Lena shook her head gently. "No," she replied, "it smells like tomorrow." Down the street, others were doing the same. In bombed-out cafes, on riverbanks, in refugee camps. Kettles hissed, mugs clinked. People brewed with trembling hands, as if afraid the dream might vanish before it finished steeping. One eyewitness described the scene in Amsterdam that afternoon. Every house with coffee made it, every house without borrowed a spoon. The whole city smelled human again. Across the canals, church bells rang for the first time since 1940. Their echoes blended with the murmur of 1,000 kettles. Liberation had many sounds: laughter, footsteps, hymns, but none so universal, so ordinary, so healing as the whistle of boiling water. By evening, Lena's small home had become a gathering place. Soldiers, children, strangers, all shared the last few drops from that tin. Someone found a harmonica, another a half-loaf of bread. They talked about rebuilding, about the brothers who wouldn't return, about what to do when the noise stopped for good. When the last light faded, Lena poured one final cup, held it to her lips, and whispered, "For those who can't taste it." A tear rolled into the mug. She didn't wipe it away. Historians would later say that Holland's true liberation wasn't May 5th, when the Germans surrendered, but May 6th, when the smell of coffee returned. Because that was the day people realized the war hadn't stolen their humanity, only delayed it. The next morning, the soldiers moved on, and the square grew quiet again. Lena stood at her doorway, watching the steam curl into the gray dawn. Somewhere far away, the same scent was rising from a farmhouse in France, a camp in Belgium, a kitchen in Warsaw. The world waking up together. She closed the tin, now empty, and placed it on her windowsill. The metal caught the light, gleaming like a small medal. And in that stillness, as the church bell struck 7, the steam lifted one last time, delicate, fading, eternal. Because even when the shooting stops, people still need something to hold, to warm, to believe in. History remembers the explosions, not the aromas. Yet, when the gunfire ceased and the flags went up, it wasn't victory parades that returned people to life. It was smaller things, a tin of coffee, a kettle that still worked, a moment of steam curling through the ruins and convincing a nation that mornings could exist again. The Dutch learned that strength wasn't only in rebuilding bridges or counting the fallen. It was in daring to brew, to sit, to pour warmth back into a world that had gone cold. They didn't drink to celebrate. They drank to remember that they could still feel. The scent of American coffee, crossing an ocean and surviving torpedoes, became the scent of resurrection. Factories had forged it, soldiers had carried it, widows had hidden it, but ordinary hands had given it meaning. For survivors like Lena, Mina, and Adrienne, that first post-war cup was more than a taste. It was proof that comfort could endure cruelty, that humanity, even when bombed to rubble, could reassemble itself through ritual, that morale, once brewed, could outlast any empire. Years later, in cafes rebuilt from stone and silence, old men would sip from porcelain cups and speak of those war winters. Some would laugh, others would lower their eyes, but all would agree. The real victory was not military, it was domestic. It lived in kettles and cups, in the simple defiance of refusing to surrender warmth. One Dutch historian wrote, "Liberation began not with flags, but with the smell of coffee drifting over broken streets." And perhaps that is how history truly heals, not through triumph, but through tenderness, restored drop by drop. Somewhere, an old survivor still keeps an empty tin on a shelf, its metal faintly rusted, its label nearly gone. On quiet mornings, he runs his fingers over the embossed words, U.S. Army Field Ration, coffee and smiles. Because long after the uniforms faded, the smell remained. Proof that morale had been brewed, not bombed.